Well, Robin, thank you so much for being with us here today. I'm just going to jump right in.
Great.
You've spent decades, and we've just heard a little bit about it, working within the criminal justice system. And you've created a number of organizations, 3, that seek to augment or alter or supplant the criminal justice system in some way. And I'm curious, what is it through your experiences that led you to believe there has to be another way to do this?
Sure. So when I was a law student, I won't ever forget the very first time I walked into a criminal courthouse. I went to 100 Center Street in New York City, and I walked to the building, and the first thing I saw was a line of black and brown men chained together, being led into a small door at the basement of the courthouse. And I thought, what is going on here that's what I see? And when I went upstairs to the courtroom, it didn't get any better. And in fact, what I saw was something that I guess was supposed to pass for justice. I saw families straining to see their loved ones. I saw people being charged and prosecuted for crimes that I knew were going on in every community, but were only being prosecuted in some. I saw the degrading and dehumanizing way that people were described and talked to while they were in that courthouse. And all I thought to myself was, this is what passes for justice in this country? And I was just a law student. I actually believed in the fundamental principles that were supposed to underlie our system, that there was a real presumption of innocence, that we had equal justice under the law, that people would be treated with respect and dignity. And what I saw instead was a two-tier system of justice that was really meant that your experience going through the system, 2 people charged with the exact same thing, would be determined by the size of your bank account and the color of your skin. And frankly, it called into question why I was going to law school to begin with. So I had 2 choices, either drop out of law school or do something about it. I decided to try to do something about it.
What I'm interested in that decision-making process, what led you to do something about it? Because we're talking about a system that has millions of people working in it, right?
Yeah.
Prosecutors, defendants, judges, probation officers, and they're looking at it through all of their unique different eyes, but from what I hear you saying, they're still making the same decisions in the same way. Why do you think that is?
So there's no question but that our criminal legal system in this country is a massive machine. And the machine is driven by plea bargaining. It's driven by putting bail on people. That means they can't get out of jail cells, so they're going to plead guilty. And that machine does, for sure, involve millions of people in every different role. And there are some very good people trying to do very good work within that machine. I know when I decided to be a public defender, I really struggled with that question. Was I just going to be part of the machine? Was I going to be complicit in what I saw was economic inequality and structural racism that was just embedded in the criminal legal system? And how was I going to justify my involvement as a public defender? And sure, I wanted to represent people, and I wanted to represent individuals from low-income and marginalized communities who were facing down the awesome and terrifying power of government that was trying to take their liberty and everything else from them. But I also saw this machine in this different way, and I think it's what sustained me, which was, if you think about a machine, I was a cog in it for sure. But if you think about that same machine, and you think about that cog, and you move it just slightly off kilter, it can mess up the entire machine. Like, it just messes it up. And maybe even it explodes someday if you mess it up badly enough. And so I thought, I'm going to be that cog that's going to be a little bit off center. And I'm going to try to work with people who can be in that machine and mess it up.
And that led to your first organization, the Bronx Defenders. I want to talk a little bit about a different way that you've been disrupting the system, specifically talking about bail. So we just heard, for example, that you were one of the Audacious Prize recipients for the Bail Project. And I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So if you're a public defender for 5 minutes, the first thing you recognize is that whether or not bail gets set at the beginning of a case is going to determine virtually everything about not only what happens to this person, but what the case dispositions are going to wind up being, and the ultimate results are going to be to somebody somebody's life, to somebody's family's life, and to somebody's community. So bail is just, for those that don't know, it's a cash amount of money that judges set to supposedly ensure somebody's return to court. And so the theory was, if you set bail in just the right amount, the accused will pay it, and it'll give them some skin in the game, and they'll come back to court, and it'll provide an incentive to come back to court. What instead you see is, as our country has grown, our jail and prison populations, and we have mass incarceration, what you've seen is that bail has become unaffordable. People can't pay it. Most people coming into the criminal legal system are from low-income communities, disproportionately people of color. And even a bail in an amount of $500 or $1,000 is too much for many families to meet. So bail became the lever to force people to plead guilty. How? Because you stand in front of the judge, and the judge sets $1,000 bail, and your client says, I don't have $1,000. And you say, yeah, but don't plead guilty. You're not guilty, don't plead guilty to this case. And they say, well, what does that mean? And I said, well, the judge is going to adjourn the case for 2 weeks. Well, what's going to happen to me? Well, you're going to stay in a jail cell until somebody can pay that bail. And that's when the prosecutors and the judges look down and they get it and they say, oh, but if your client pleads guilty, counselor, I'll let her go home in 2 days, or I'll let her go home right now. And under those circumstances, anybody will plead guilty, whether they did it or not. So what I realized was bail was the sort of at the front end of the system driving mass incarceration. In this way that was unprecedented. So in 2007, I co-founded actually something called the Bronx Freedom Fund with my husband David, who was also a public defender. And it was the idea was to have a revolving bail fund. And we'd never tried it before, and we didn't know whether it was going to work. Lots of people told us, nobody's going to come back to court because it's not their money, right? Because we went and raised money, created an organization to sort of raise philanthropic dollars and pay people's bail. And we began to pay people's bail who couldn't afford it. And what we learned very, very quickly was 95 to 96% of the time, every client came back for every court appearance. So it just smashed the myth that money was the incentive to come back to court.
And was that irrespective of what they were charged with?
It was irrespective of the charge. We also saw that it had a downstream impact, meaning not only did it allow people to come out of those jail cells, which, by the way, are horrifying and terrifying, and terrible things happen to you when you're in jail. So it actually prevented that from happening. It also prevented loss of job, loss of home, loss of child custody, loss of your immigration status, not getting kicked out of school. It was that preventative measure. But we also saw a downstream impact, which is over half the cases got dismissed once we paid bail. Wow. Which really began to have us understand very early on, oh, so bail is what's driving the decision making. Bail is what makes the machine possible. Bail is the oil that's greasing the wheels. So we set up the revolving bail fund because bail comes back at the end of a case. So if you put $1 in, it comes back when the case is over, assuming somebody comes back to court. And we began to bail people out. We were lucky enough to be an audacious winner, and that is to take our Bronx Freedom Fund model that we built for a decade in the Bronx and scale it across the country. And we're starting that this year.
So one of the questions that I want to make sure we're understanding is what the scope of this problem is. How many
Sure.
people are there under bail conditions at any moment?
So in any given night, there are almost 500,000 mothers and fathers and sons and daughters who are going to sleep in jail cells across this country who have not been convicted of a crime. Remember, bail gets set before you're convicted of a crime where you are supposed to be, right, covered in the presumption of innocence, regardless of your income or your race or the neighborhood you come from or your background. That's not how it operates.
And so looking at the statistics that you've given us, so this incredible amount of folks are showing up when bail is set for them, not even being their own dollar. I guess
Yep.
the question is, do we even need a bail system at all?
So it's a great question. And what we know is that cash bail is not necessary. Right? That it really just works and creates a two-tier system of justice, one for the rich and one for everybody else. So unaffordable cash bail has to be eliminated, and has to be eliminated now. The big question is, what do people really need to come back to court, right? Society has an interest in people coming back to court. What we've learned over the 10 years of running the fund, and what we're seeing now as we scale across the nation, is what people really need are effective notification systems that let them know when their next court date is, They need support through the process in case there is a problem that arises, like lack of transportation or a childcare crisis or a health crisis of some sort, and that people need to be connected to services that they need. And if you create that new vision of what pretrial justice looks like, you will get return rates like we see at the Bronx Freedom Fund and at the Bail Project. People will come back to court, and there'll be more justice, and people can make decisions about what to do on their criminal cases in consultation with their families and their lawyers and their communities, rather than make a decision based on desperation and the need to get home.
One additional question that I know folks have wondered about. So there's this, you're providing cash bail, people are able to go home, they're keeping their jobs. But if the goal is to eliminate the unaffordable cash bail,
Sure.
how does providing the bail funds disrupt that system that is creating it in the first place?
Sure. So lots of people say, isn't a bail fund a Band-Aid? And my answer is yes. It's not meant to be a permanent solution. It's a tool. It's a Band-Aid. Band-Aids stop bleeding. Band-Aids stop infection. Band-Aids can actually save your life. So yes, in the immediate, the goal is to be a not-for-profit direct service organization that is ending the sort of human suffering. And make no mistake about it, this is a human rights crisis in this country, given how many people are holding in jail cells, to get people out right away, as fast as we can, in as many places as we can. That's one goal. The other goal, though, is to use what we're learning, the data and the human stories, right? And to digging deep into this issue and the nuance of this issue, and to re-envision and create what the system, a pretrial system, should look like, right? To literally recreate how we think about what we do to people before they've even been convicted of a crime. And yes, to do away with cash bail.
Excellent. So we're here at TEDxKC Women, and I want to focus a little bit too on another organization that you founded, Still She Rises, which is an organization serving women in Tulsa, Oklahoma. You know, many people in this room are familiar with statistics regarding incarceration, right? We have over 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States, 500% increase in the last 40 years, but the vast majority of those individuals are men, 90% of them, right? 1 in 3 Black men will be incarcerated, 1 in 6 Latino men. So I guess my question is, why focus on women?
So what most people don't know is that women are the fastest growing population in jails and prisons across this country. Women's incarceration rates have grown 700% in the past several decades. It's twice the growth of men's incarceration. And because the numbers of women are still in the minority, their voices and their experiences are getting completely drowned out in public defender offices, in courthouses, right, by a system that was really constructed with men in mind. So we were lucky enough to be able to start a project in Oklahoma called Still She Rises that is the first public defender's office in the nation dedicated exclusively to the representation of people who identify as women and who are primary caregivers and mothers. So we are really digging into this issue using a holistic defender model, meaning providing representation and resources in all the areas of a woman's life to understand what the criminal legal system is doing to her, to her family, to her children, and to the intergenerational nature of poverty.
And so what are these differences we're seeing in the typical model meant for men, and what should be happening for women in the criminal justice system?
So one of the first things you see is because 80% of women going into the criminal legal system are primary caregivers or mothers, what you see that's very different is the intersection of the child welfare system and the criminal system and how those operate together. There are lots and lots of systems that are grinding up our clients generally, right? There's, and you have to look at all those things to do holistic defense. But for women in particular, it really is about the child welfare system and the criminal system acting together in tandem to not just throw women in cages and put them in jail, but destroy their families. And you have to be addressing both those systems at the same time. You also have much higher levels of women who are struggling with mental illness. You have women who are struggling with drug addiction. Most women coming to the system are charged with nonviolent offenses, overwhelmingly drug offenses and economic crimes. You see that once they're in jail, they're treated unfairly. There was a great study out of Northwestern that talked about even once women are in jail, what happens is they're punished more harshly than their male counterparts for minor infractions. So you see women being driven into the system more and more, and the devastation of them and their families and their children as a result of that involvement. And so it's very different.
What is driving this increase of incarceration of women?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly women were one of the unintended victims of our very misplaced war on drugs. And it varies from state to state, right? Oklahoma is the #1 incarcerated women in the world. That, which is why we decided to start there, right? You go where the problem is worst, you look where the history is most egregious, and we really wanted to dig into what's happening in this, area. But Oklahoma's not alone. If you think about the fact that women are the fastest growing population in jails and prisons everywhere, this is a new problem, right? The lens of the criminal legal system has turned its eyes on women, and when you do that, you turn its eyes on their children as well.
And what are the sorts of things you're finding that public defenders or systems should be taking in consideration when they're representing women to augment that?
So, we're hoping that Still She Rises becomes a blueprint for how you defend women in the system. I like to laugh that I have spent my entire life trying to talk about and prove that women are the same as men. We can become leaders, we can be presidents. Wish. We'll get there. We can be as innovative and strong and create amazing things. And now I spend a lot of time talking about how women are different. And they're different in the criminal legal system. And so public defenders need to recognize how the systems interact differently with them, but also how to interact differently with women who are very oftentimes still suffering in sort of traumatic relationships, are still being victimized in all sorts of ways, both in their personal lives and externally. And what that means in terms of everything from how you interview a woman, right, and what her needs are, and to think about how you interact in a different way. Because women are very often, when they're entering the criminal legal system, unlike men, actively engaged in relationships where they are being abused and they are surviving. And that makes it different.
We've talked about a bunch of different parts of the criminal justice system, and you've noted a lot of ways in which the criminal justice system doesn't seem to be doing a lot of justice. So I'm wondering what you think we can be doing when we think about this to make sure that our system is rooted in justice going forward.
That's a great question. So I think what I've learned over my career, and that's what the video is that you saw, right, which is the work has to be grounded in the experience and the expertise of people who are impacted by the system. So you have to be guided by those voices, you have to incorporate those voices, and you have to incorporate those perspectives. And so you have to get proximate, right? I did a learning tour, and part of the learning tour that I did to set up Still She Rises, the same way I did at the Bronx Defenders, was literally to go and do focus groups and talk to every person I could who was personally impacted by the system, and understand from their shoes, in their shoes, what they think public defense should look like, what they need, what the advocacy needs are, how we can be doing better, and to constantly challenge ourselves to be intentional about that.
And how are you working then to continue to not just incorporate, but to empower those voices in the organization that you're leading?
So you do that in every possible way you can, from advisory councils to hiring people in your offices who are formerly incarcerated. In our bail project, we have a central team that supports the work that gets done in local communities, but the work that's being done in local communities is actually being done by staff, full-time staff we call bail disruptors. Most of those people who are working as bail disruptors, who are running the local sites, interviewing clients, paying bail, supporting clients, connecting to local advocacy campaigns to end unaffordable cash bail. The majority of bail disruptors in our project have been personally impacted by the system, and they really guide the project and its development, and have taught me an enormous amount, and are the heart and soul of the project and the work that we're doing. The same is true at Still She Rises and the Bronx Defenders. It's critical to make sure those voices and experiences are part of what you create, in partnership with people who are impacted by it.
Wonderful. And just before we go, I want to know, I know a lot of people are here and are hearing this huge problem, right? Problems for women, problems about bail, the criminal justice system is vast, and it may seem like the problem is so big. What advice would you give them? What is something that everyone in this room can be doing to help improve our system of justice?
Educate yourselves, get proximate, and what that might mean is go to your local criminal courthouse and do what I did when I was a law student. It's going to horrify you, and you're going to recognize that what's happening in this country is unforgivable and indefensible. And more importantly, to remember that what our legal system looks like, what the values are that underlie it, implicates every single one of us, whether or not it touches you personally. Because the legal system, when a prosecutor stands up, right, and is prosecuting a case, the thing the prosecutor says is, so-and-so and so-and-so, in the name of the people of the state of Missouri, or the people of the state of New York. That's each and every one of us. So get educated, get proximate to the problem, do whatever you can, right? Volunteer, pay a bail, offer your services, offer your perspectives, have dinners with people and inform them and educate them. Be aware of who your judges are when you're voting, be aware who your prosecutor is and what their values are. And mostly, the most important thing, speak out, speak out, speak out. Speak out in the face of injustice. Speak out.
Thank you so much, Robin. Thank you for speaking out.